Hi, everybody. Welcome to our latest webinar series. For those who have joined us over the last 15 months, welcome back. For those who are just joining us for the first time, we're glad to have you. Today is an exciting day. It's first an exciting day because my 14-year-old will be getting her vaccine shot, which will serve as a public service announcement for all our viewers to go get their shots. This is good for all of you listeners because it's at 2 p.m., so we're going to have to end on time. But it's also an exciting day because we have an incredible lineup to talk about frameworks for autonomous vehicle regulations and safety, starting with Dr. Steve Cliff, who's the acting administrator at NHTSA, and moving towards a new paper that's going to be released today from Kevin Vincent, a general counsel, former general counsel of NHTSA, and finally with an incredible panel. Let me start by just saying that for those who don't know SAFE advances transformative transportation and mobility technologies to enhance U.S. energy security and economic resilience. You know, at SAFE, we're also deeply committed to ensuring that our nation's ability to secure key aspects of this technology supply, which is why this topic is so important to us. Initially, SAFE really has been concerned about the use of oil as the sole transportation fuel and have been big advocates of electrification. And what we've done is over time, as we've worked on electrification, seen how autonomous vehicles and EVs fuse together, that really maybe they're not as distinct as we think, and that one will, in fact, enhance the other and increase the deployment. And as we've been working on this, we've come to discover so many great benefits, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, from equity for the disadvantaged, the elderly, and the disabled, improving the economic productivity of the United States, important for our competition with China, and finally, saving lives on our roads. So with that, let me first introduce our first speaker, our keynote speaker, which will be Dr. Steve Cliff, who is the acting administrator of NHTSA. For those who don't know, NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, sets safety standards for our country, identifies defects and manages recalls, and educates Americans on driving, riding, and walking safely. One of my bigger problems is walking safely. In fact, I have broken my foot getting out of a cab. And also sets emission standards, fuel economy standards for our road, and helps with the testing and deployment of new technologies like autonomy. Dr. Cliff served as the Deputy Executive Officer of CARB, which he first joined in 2008. He's also served as the Assistant Director of Sustainability at the California Department of Transportation, was appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to serve as a Senior Advisor to CARB's Board Chair, Mary Nichols, who is actually a Commissioner of our Commission on the Future of Mobility here at SAFE, and he's played an active role at UC Davis over several decades. He has a BA and a PhD in chemistry from UC San Diego and a postdoc on atmospheric sciences at UC Davis. So with that, Dr. Cliff, welcome to the position. We are thrilled to have you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say on this topic.
Thanks. Thank you, Robbie. I really appreciate it. It's been great over these many years that you and I have had a chance to work together, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the audience today. I know that SAFE, you and SAFE have really pushed a lot of important conversations and continued that great work during the last 14 months during the pandemic. And congratulations to your child. I think it's fantastic that the vaccines are now available to those under 18. So that's really great news. And I can only hope that we're continuing our progress to move towards a new normal. So good afternoon and thank you to everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. I'm actually here in California. It's an exciting time for transportation, and I'm really glad that you're highlighting how technology can help improve safety and mobility for everyone. So I've been at NHTSA for about 3 months now, and it's really been my honor to serve in the US DOT in the Biden-Harris administration. I'm really glad to be joining such a great team. At my colleagues at DOT and especially at NHTSA, I've seen firsthand how NHTSA's 600 plus employees really strive to further the agency's mission. Save lives, reduce crashes, the economic impacts that those crashes cause, and more importantly, to reduce serious injuries and fatalities. Everything we do is focused on achieving that mission and making transportation more environmentally responsible and more equitable. I say that because we can achieve both of those goals at the same time. We don't have to choose just one. We can have a safe transportation system and one that's environmentally responsible and equitable. And it brings me to one of the major priorities of the Biden-Harris administration, climate change. Robbie, you mentioned this. It's an important component of how we move forward as a nation. As President Biden said recently at the White House, we've already waited too long to deal with the climate crisis. We can't wait any longer. Our future, our children's future, depends on what we do right now to address climate change. To reverse the path that we're on, we must look at all sources of emissions, starting with the largest, and that's transportation. We know we can't address climate change without addressing the role that passenger cars and light trucks play in rising CO2 emissions. The president's call to action on climate change will drive much of our work at the US DOT and at NHTSA, starting with the corporate average fuel economy, or CAFE rule. Robbie mentioned this in the beginning. One of the things we do at DOT is set fuel economy standards for the nation. And just hours after taking the oath of office, the president signed an executive order directing the US Department of Transportation to immediately review the 2 safe vehicle rules issued last summer. No relation, of course, to this safe. This was President Trump's attempt to deregulate the automobile industry by rolling back the fuel economy standards that had been put in place during the prior administration, during Obama. And this executive order frames these reviews and many others as actions to advance environmental justice. We've since issued a notice of proposed rulemaking in response to that executive order. And that notice of proposed rulemaking proposes to withdraw the so-called Safe One rule that was intended to preempt state transportation greenhouse gas and ZEV regulations from being put in place. And I knew that well, having worked in California, since we were really the subject of that rule and were most affected by it. So we're hard at work evaluating the Safe 2 rule, which sets fuel economy standards through 2026. I should note that the Safe 1 rule was just published in the Federal Register and is in a 30-day comment period. So for those of you who are interested, we're really interested in hearing your comments and getting your feedback on that rule. Climate and air pollution disproportionately impact low-income and communities of color. And to truly transform our environmental future, we must change how vehicles are powered, moving to zero emissions. President Biden's American Jobs Plan will invest $174 billion to accelerate the electric vehicle revolution and move us towards a zero-emission future. His plan will help spur domestic supply chains and raw materials to parts, retool factories to compete globally, and support American workers to make batteries and electric vehicles. It would also create a network of 500,000 charging stations nationally, a critical investment to ensure widespread EV adoption. And the American Jobs Plan would give consumers rebates for buying EVs, helping to speed up the transition to electrification and spread the benefits of EV ownership to more Americans, not just the wealthy. I've had a lot of discussions with the automotive industry over the last several months, and I know they support the goals of the American Jobs Plan, recognizing that the future lies in renewable energy and electrification, not in gasoline-powered and diesel-powered engines. This will help Americans across the country, including rural areas where people drive the longest distances and stand to save the most by not having to pay for gas. These EV investments will also be critical to ensuring that vehicles of the future are built right here in the United States. It's part of the millions of good-paying jobs that the American Jobs Plan will create. And there will undoubtedly be challenges along the way, but great opportunities. We will not reach zero emissions overnight, so it's important to ensure that cars and trucks with internal combustion engines sold today and in the future are as efficient as possible. NHTSA will play to join us in reducing harmful pollution. We do the same when it comes to road safety. It's even more important right now as we're facing a unique crisis on our roads caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Early in the crisis, we identified a rise in risky driving behaviors on our roads. As health officials reminded us to limit ourselves to essential trips, many drivers stayed home. But some of those who were out on the roads were more likely to engage in risky actions, such as not wearing a seatbelt, speeding, or driving after using drugs or alcohol. As a result, traffic crash fatalities for the first time went up, first time in several years went up in 2020 and increased by about 4.6%, all while VMT, that is vehicle miles traveled, decreased by 14.5%. All told, that translates into a more than 20% increase in the fatality rate last year. That should motivate each of us to work harder, to develop solutions, and collaborate to help curb these risky behaviors and save lives. NHTSA is educating drivers about the most common dangerous driving behaviors: driving impaired, driving without a seatbelt, driving distracted, and driving at high speeds. And we also believe that when applied smartly, technology, including advanced vehicle technologies, can help address these dangerous behaviors and save lives. AVs, the subject of today's discussion, or as we call them, automated driving systems, are generally in the development phase and being tested in limited conditions on public roads, but still they hold great promise to one day improve safety, as well as the possibility to expand mobility and accessibility for seniors and people with disabilities, and improve transportation equity in underserved communities. But surveys show the public remains largely skeptical about ADS-equipped vehicles, and building that public trust will be the key to widespread adoption. It's not enough to just develop the technology. The public has to trust that it's safe for themselves and for their families. While ADS-equipped vehicles may hold safety benefits, these benefits may never be realized if we don't gain that public trust. And as we've seen in other areas of technology, the public has a very low tolerance for what we call machine errors. Errors that a human driver may make become much more unnerving when made by a computer system. When it comes to widespread adoption of ADS, aiming for as good as a human driver may not be enough. As ADS vehicles are tested and deployed, transparency can help ensure the public understands how the technology works and the safeguards in place. The entire industry, from manufacturers to operators, needs to be as transparent with challenges as they are with opportunities and breakthroughs. And transparency is important to us at NHTSA as well. Our AV test initiative includes a public-facing website where anyone can learn about on-road testing and deployment of ADS vehicles in their communities. And we will use every tool at our disposal to gather data, better understand emerging issues, and ensure the safety of the public. As ADS development continues, we ensure everyone in this space to consider how those vehicles can expand mobility for seniors, people with disabilities, and underserved communities. These vehicles could one day serve people who are not able to drive themselves or have been reliant on sparse bus networks. However, they need to be designed with the needs of many different users in mind, and that includes protections and user interfaces to meet the needs of people of all sizes, gender, age, and mobility. Equity cannot be an afterthought. It needs to be considered and addressed throughout the process. And we also cannot forget about child safety. Just as the safety of children in our personal vehicles is critical, so must be the safety of children in the design and deployment of ADS-equipped vehicles. We encourage the industry to consider how to better protect children in unconventional seating configurations, how to ensure effective child restraint system installations and usage in ride-sharing models, and how to plan for emerging risks involving unattended children. Again, this goes back to ensuring the public trust. Families who do not feel ADS vehicles are safe for their children will never adopt the technology. As the technology develops, we're going to continue to engage with developers and testers to ensure the public's safety. We also look forward to hearing from stakeholders like you as we release new proposals and policies. In fact, please stay tuned for more information about our agency's regulatory priorities on safety, including ADS technology and equity in the Spring Unified Agenda, which should be coming out very soon. While ADS technology isn't available for purchase today by the public, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems, or ADAS, are here now. They can help reduce the severity of crashes and perhaps even prevent them, but only if they are used correctly. Since ADAS can encompass many technologies, people need to know what their car can do, and even more importantly, what it can't do. As names for these features vary by manufacturer, and some technologies warn a driver while others take momentary action for the driver, there's a serious education challenge here. NHTSA continues to educate drivers about the features of their vehicles as well as their limitations. I want to assure you of my deep and abiding commitment to NHTSA's safety mission. We will remain vigilant in our oversight role and act when appropriate. Technology is moving fast, and we have important work ahead of us. As I've outlined over the past few minutes, it's a time of great change, but one that has the potential to revolutionize the way we live and travel. The industry is moving towards more automation, and that comes with the promise of improved safety and better environmental practices, only if we can make sure in the design and execution of this technology that is incorporated. This moment, with the American Jobs Plan currently moving through Congress, it's also an opportunity to address inequities and racial disparities that have been perpetuating for generations. We believe we can have it all. We can build a transportation system that creates a safer, more equitable, and sustainable world for ourselves and future generations. And in building it, we can create millions of good jobs that last for a long time to come. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cliff. We look forward to working with you, and best of luck. And we hope that you will move expeditiously so that we can bring some of these technologies and save more lives on your road. So with that, I'll turn to explaining why SAFE has really embraced this mission of autonomy. I guess I could call this, "How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways," by Shakespeare in his famous sonnet. You just heard the word revolution, and yes, we are on the greatest revolution in mobility on a scale unseen since the invention of the internal combustion engine and its mass production with Model Ts rolling off the line in 1908. And it always seems crazy when you say all these things will change and possibly could get better, but yet when you think about it, our entire society has been built around this internal combustion engine, mostly owned by private individuals. Our homes, our work, everything has been designed around that. So of course, if we change that, everything will also change. As I mentioned, SAFE, which is an organization that has been committed to ending our dependence on oil for economic and national security, really came to AVs because we are involved in the deployment of electric vehicles and saw how difficult it was to get these deployed. And in thinking about Uber and Lyft and how quickly they had changed people's habits, as well as the cell phone and how people don't really buy their phone for the phone, but for everything else, we started thinking about what I think is commonly known in this space as CASE, Connected Autonomous Shared Electric, or ACEs. But it's really the force multiplying effect of all these technologies coming together. Really the improvements in batteries, in sensors, in big data. And by bringing these together, one can see each one reinforcing its other and speeding it up. So we really saw this as an opportunity to accelerate electrification itself, and I'll get there in a moment. But as you heard from Dr. Cliff, there are so many ways that this can impact people. So we started doing studies, and if I took you on a little journey of some of the things we discovered. In 2017, we published our first paper, Self-Driving Cars, the Impact of People with Disabilities, and showed that 2 million people in the United States who currently have a disability and cannot get to work would be able to get to work if there was an autonomous vehicle able to take them. Not only that, we started looking at reduced medical costs from people showing up at appointments who otherwise can't get there. In 2020, we recently put out a paper that showed that autonomous shared electric vehicles, which will cost on average about 50 cents a mile, as opposed to over $1.30 a mile in current transportation. Some people think it's lower, some people will say it's higher, but this can really provide that low cost point-to-point mobility that Americans without a car need, or people with a car and are spending on a car and otherwise not spending on their homes. In fact, many homes are actually non-affordable if one takes transportation into consideration. And when you can bring a cheaper form of transportation and lower the cost of that, homes become more affordable that people have otherwise bought into. Remember, this is the second largest expense. Some places, even the largest expense. Also, the importance to productivity and economic growth. This is really similar to the intercontinental railroads or the interstate highway. There is a exponential impact of shrinking geography. And when we did those things, we had a tremendous amount of productivity, built into the American economy, and that can do this as well. And we did a study in 2018 that showed $800 billion per year by 2050 would be found with, yes, workforce impact, but less workforce impact than one would otherwise expect. Also, the cost of accidents, which total in this country over 242 billion jobs, according to NHTSA, which is 1.6% of our GDP. If you brought into the quality of life valuation of these accidents, we're talking about $836 billion based on these accidents. So not only the loss of life, but really we're leaving money on our streets as we get into so many crashes. So by limiting those, one could find that economic productivity. We just heard about climate change and the importance to the administration. And as I say, that's how we got to this topic, by looking at how it could increase and accelerate electrification. That synergy as companies want to offer shared services and see themselves using electric vehicles, both for business reasons, but then also the technical reasons. Most AVs are actually EVs or hybrids. And as I say, there's both technical and commercial reasons. So many people might get into a car, not know how it's being fueled, but most likely that will be fueled by EVs, electrification, even though they'll just order it as an AV. And that's, as I said, similar to the phone. We buy it for its operating system and don't really think about the phone. And that will be the same here. I think recently, and maybe the only bipartisan issue in Washington, D.C. at the moment, is this competition with China. And we may have, and we'll talk about this with our panel, we may have a leadership role today, but China is clearly focused on taking the lead in this area. And they have a better opportunity to provide the regulatory frameworks for deployment, and that puts us at risk. So maybe we invent some of the technology, but it does not get deployed here and gets deployed there. China is focused on many things, including international organizations that are standard-setting bodies. This is a big problem for the United States, and we need to get more engaged. SAFE has been part of the UN Economic Commission for Europe, the WP29 Forum for harmonization of vehicle regulations, and watching those types of debates really gives us pause on how active we are and how we need to be more active. Two is China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology says that China has now entered the fast lane on autonomous vehicles. 27 cities have awarded permits to over 70 companies. Just recently, Beijing and Shanghai have seen over 2.5 million kilometers of AVs driving testing per year. This is 10% more than the US companies in California. Just this month, Baidu rolled out its paid driverless taxi service in Beijing. And all this is heavily funded by the Chinese government. And so how are we going to compete? Is Waymo going to be there? Is Cruise? Or is it going to be Baidu? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves. Now, there are many people who believe that this future could be dystopian. So I guess the question is this going to be dystopian or not? Now, one thing at SAFE we believe is we need to think differently about the vehicles that might be autonomous. And that's where other regulations come in, like the FMVSS, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard, right? We don't have to think about large vehicles traveling everywhere. What we really need to do is think about different types of vehicles, smaller vehicles, different sizes doing different jobs. And that's why it's key that we not only have a regulatory framework in terms of safety to provide the rules of the road, but really allow companies to innovate now, because it could possibly dystopia in just having the same types of vehicles doing the same type of thing. But if we can develop them from the ground up, they can be quite different weights, different sizes, and everything else. So this is actually what's so critical about this moment. This is a moment where companies are thinking about retooling. They're thinking about other vehicles. They're thinking about business models. So we really have to think more boldly here. It's kind of upsetting that in the recent debate on the Endless Frontiers Act, which is about the competition with China, we couldn't even get an amendment introduced, which was ultimately stopped by the Teamsters and the trial lawyers. We need to think about the future. Yes, we need to make sure that we don't hurt the people involved, but we need to think about the rollout now. Anyways, let me end with a few statistics on safety, because that is what we are talking about. 94% of human accidents are caused by human error, and as you just heard, we had an uptick even when people are not driving on the roads, with 42,000 dead, according to the National Safety Council. So what do we need to do? We need, first of all, for the public to understand why this is just bigger than saving lives on the road. It will impact everything in our lives, and we need to make sure that the United States is ahead. We need a roadmap, of course, so that companies can do this safely and that people have trust. We need our agencies to step up if Capitol Hill will not. And we need to not only think about the safety roadmap, but also exemptions, so that we can think about how we not just have the current vehicles that are driving autonomously, but rather an entire different set of vehicles that actually bring some of these gains I was talking about and make it a positive experience. Just those exemptions, I would note, can create 40,000 jobs on our road in a study we did. 40,000 jobs. They could create $2.5 billion of immediate spending for retrofitting 10 factories as companies are deciding what they want to do and what their vehicles could look like. So this is the moment, and this is why we care so much. And this is why we asked Kevin Vincent to think about how he would create a regulatory framework if he could, based on his past experience at NHTSA. So I'm excited to introduce Kevin Vincent, who is now the Associate General Counsel for Regulatory Issues at Lucid. Although he's not coming under that umbrella. He wrote this a while back. He's coming to us totally in his personal capacity, and he's using his experience as Chief Counsel for NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, to provide for us his views on how to create a regulatory framework for both the testing and the deployment of electric vehicles. Thank you so much for working on this paper, Kevin, and we can't wait to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Robbie. And you actually stole my thunder. You stole my initial disclaimer, but I'll repeat it. Although I am working for Lucid now, this paper was written before Lucid, and it reflects only my own personal views and not those of the company. I'd like to thank Robbie. I'd like to thank Alyssa, Ron, everybody at SAFE for supporting me and sponsoring this project in this article, and for their edits and comments on the paper, and for, of course, for publishing it today, and for inviting me, for giving me an excuse to pull a suit out of the closet. I was very pleased. I haven't worn one of these in a year, so I was pleased to put one on to join you here today to formally present the paper to the public. And thank you for that opportunity. I'd also like to thank Dr. Cliff for his opening remarks. And more importantly, I'd like to thank you for the work you have been doing at NHTSA to change the direction of the agency from the Trump administration with regards to improving fuel economy and with regards to laying the groundwork for electric vehicles. And notwithstanding my initial disclaimer, I think that thank to Dr. Cliff is on behalf of the company and not just on my own behalf. But everything else today is just me. So with that, let me say the article begins with a survey of autonomous vehicle regulation today, which is, frankly, there is no autonomous vehicle regulation specifically. Instead, NHTSA has been addressing the impediments in the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, the FMVSS, which are blocking the development of autonomous vehicles. And they've been methodically but slowly revising the FMVSS to remove those impediments. There is a void, however, in the fundamental regulation of the driver of an automated vehicle, of an autonomous vehicle, because they will be driverless. There will be no human driver. And the FMVSS, of course, were written assuming there would be a human driver. So there is nothing right at the federal level regulating the ADS. As a result, the states have stepped in, and there has become a patchwork of a few states, starting with California, regulating the autonomous vehicle. And other states have joined, and those regulations range from some pretty strict regulations, as in California, and much more relaxed or frankly wide open invitations to deploy and test autonomous vehicles in other states. The opening of the article also essentially makes the case for federal regulation. Dr. Cliff talked about the need to generate trust in the public, and fundamentally, the premise of the article is the public is not going to trust autonomous vehicles unless the federal government is regulating them. But frankly, I would recommend that you read not just the article that I wrote, but more importantly, the comments that SAFE filed with NHTSA in response to the advance notice of proposed rulemaking that NHTSA issued late last year, asking for recommendations for a framework for ADS safety. Even though this article was written before that ANPRM was actually issued, I'm proposing a framework using the same terminology that NHTSA issued in its ANPRM. And that's because when I was in the Obama administration, we were wrestling with these same issues. How do you regulate autonomous vehicles, and can we even regulate autonomous vehicles? And I know NHTSA has continued wrestling with that issue. So I addressed that in the article. The article lays out 3 prongs for a regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles. The first prong is the prong of adopting performance standards. The second prong is the adoption of process standards. And the third prong is that NHTSA should move to a policy of prompt corrective action for any new safety risks that manifest themselves with autonomous vehicles. So let me talk about the first prong first, performance standards. The performance standards are focusing on the decision maker in the vehicle, in the ADS, and how are those decisions made. And there are a number of performance standards that are now being developed by industry. And the article surveys the different performance standards that are being developed, and it focuses on one of them, IEEE P2846, which is based on the responsibility sensitive safety methodology, which was developed by Mobileye and Intel. And the IEEE effort of all the industry efforts to develop performance standards that I review in the article seems to be the performance standard that is closest to culmination, that closest to adoption by consensus within the industry. And so I recommend that NHTSA be evaluating IEEE P2846 and any other performance standards to adopt them as a basis for a standard to regulate the ADS and the FMVSS. Now, it's not so much that I recommend IEEE P2846 over other standards because it's better, but because I think it's closest to becoming an industry standard, and NHTSA has authority to adopt industry consensus standards as a basis for a new federal motor vehicle safety standard. So that's why I focus on that standard. Jack Weiss is going to be speaking on the panel after this, and Jack can probably address the current status of that. I hope he will, to let us know if it is going to come out as a final standard this year, as I am predicting, and at the time I wrote the article was the predicted status for that standard. The second prong of the recommendations in my proposed regulatory framework is that NHTSA adopt process standards. And this is somewhat of a hodgepodge of different standards that have been developed by the autonomous vehicle industry for the design of autonomous and other advanced electronics vehicles. So that includes design standards, it includes manufacturing standards that are actually applicable industry-wide. It includes testing standards specifically for autonomous vehicles. And the process standards that I recommend include taxonomy standards to make sure that when we talk about autonomous vehicles, we're all using the same terms. Many of these standards that I address in the process standards of the proposed regulatory framework have already been adopted. There are a few that are still under development. But the point of NHTSA adopting those standards is for NHTSA to take the state of the art, which has been developed in the industry, and make it federal, binding federal requirement. The third prong of the proposed regulatory framework is prompt corrective action. And this would be a fundamental change in the way NHTSA is now addressing unreasonable risk to safety when it identifies that in the auto industry. NHTSA's traditional approach has been to compare statistics between different models by NHTSA's Office of Defects Investigation, ODI. And what I'm recommending instead is that NHTSA focus on a case-by-case basis with any crashes that involve autonomous vehicles. And that's because of the array, the wealth of sensor data, which is available on any autonomous vehicle with radar and LiDAR and cameras and a huge amount of computer data, which is all tracked in the vehicle. It will be possible to reconstruct actually what went wrong in every autonomous vehicle crash. And NHTSA can use that on a case-by-case basis to take very prompt corrective action. As soon as the data is analyzed, NHTSA and industry will be able to determine, did the autonomous vehicle make a mistake? And if so, then they can work together to develop a correction for that mistake. And then those corrections can be shared industry-wide. So that ties to some of the other changes that I'm recommending in the prompt corrective action prong, which are really going to the point of transparency, which Dr. Cliff rightly pointed out is needed in the autonomous vehicle industry in order to ensure public trust. So using an analysis of anything that goes wrong and results in or fails to avoid a crash involving an AV, there can be continuous improvement in the autonomous vehicle industry. And that's what I'm recommending with this prompt corrective action. And then finally, another step in prompt corrective action would be the formation of an AV ISAC, an autonomous vehicle or automated vehicle industry analysis center. And that recommendation would allow industry to share fixes, share solutions and problems within the industry to, again, enhance transparency. Now, my article, I use the alliteration in 3 Ps with performance, process, and prompt corrective action. That's because it's a good way to write an article. But in some ways, you could boil down my recommendations to 2 fundamental recommendations. One is that NHTSA should use its authority under the National Technology Transfer Act to adopt industry standards to create federal regulations for AVs as soon as possible, to bring the safety benefits of AVs, which will save lives because they will not make the same mistakes that humans make, driving drunk, driving distracted, speeding, and other mistakes that humans make. That can come quicker to the American people if we adopt industry standards as federal regulations. And then finally, if we change NHTSA's enforcement practice to quickly address any new safety risk, we can assure the public that NHTSA is promptly and immediately correcting with industry any new risks that are created. That way, the public will trust AVs. And that's the summary of my article. Thank you for inviting me today. You're on mute, Robbie.
I keep doing that. Haven't learned over 15 months. Thank you so much, Kevin. People can find our article at www.secureenergy.org. And please download it, read it, and we look forward to your comments. Let's move to our panel, which is really an incredible panel. It's such a diverse group of people. from an industry perspective. Really, we have people from OEMs, partnerships between OEMs and tier ones, people who have worked at NHTSA, NTSB, so government experience, traditional and part suppliers, cars and trucks, startups, and established companies. Really, really quite exciting. So I'll introduce everyone very quickly by alphabetical order so we can get into the panel. We have Nat Buse, who's Aurora's head of safety, and he was at NHTSA as the associate administrator for vehicle safety at NHTSA. We have Dean Gazio, who's the global director of safety engineering at Motional. He has spent time at Waymo and GM and Aptiv, and he was a safety leader at Cruise. He's got the, as they say on the Sunday talk shows, all the Sunday talk shows at one time. We have Debbie Hirschman, who is the chair of the NTSB, president of the National Safety Council. She's chaired the Road to Zero Coalition, and she's been a lead of safety at Waymo and now serves on the board of Velodyne. And we have Desi Uzjakshevik, who's the global director of Ford's Global Automotive Safety Engineering Office and has spent time globally working for Ford on these issues. And finally, Jack Wiest, who's well known by many, who is an Intel Fellow and VP for Automated Vehicle Standards at Mobileye. Thank you all for being here today. So hopefully we can have a great conversation. Maybe just open up with Jack. Jack, if you could give us a sense where the US stands as opposed to other countries, and if you really took, I guess, a purely US perspective, what is at risk if we don't change our ways here and what we should do?
Well, thanks, Robbie. First, let me thank SAFE for hosting this event today. Let me also thank Dr. Cliff for coming and bringing his thoughts. It's important for industry and NHTSA to be working closely together, and Kevin for the excellent paper that we look forward to reading. I think Kevin really said it well in the sense that performance standards are needed now. And I think it would be quite ironic that the country who has led the world in the development of automated vehicle technology could end up being the last to deploy. We're seeing incredible progress in Germany in particular, as well as in the European Commission, with very detailed draft regulations that have clear performance requirements and guidance for industry that industry can meet to commercially deploy as soon as 2022 or 2023. And so we need that same kind of action and that same kind of framework here in the US so that we can enjoy the safety benefits and societal benefits of this technology.
Thank you so much, Jack. Let me turn to Debbie. Debbie, maybe give us a sense of where NHTSA has been, where NHTSA, where they came from, where they are now, where they need to go. What are your views on this? I mean, no one has been a bigger passion for safety and zero deaths than you in so many roles, and actually looked at accidents after they happen. So I totally trust your views on this. Where are we, where have we come from, and where should we be going?
Yeah, so I'd say the biggest concern for me is that NHTSA and DOT have long been leaders in automotive safety, and nature really abhors a vacuum. And so if NHTSA doesn't occupy that space, others will. And I'd say this is a challenge on 4 different fronts: internationally, nationally, with the industry in general. Jack did a great job covering the international aspect, and I think we're trailing in this space. The leader in AV technology to be the leader in setting the safety standards too. Nationally, I'd say the challenge here is that we have so many states that are implementing their own standards. And so we have a patchwork system that is not good for industry and it's not good for public safety. The third area where I think there's tremendous, not just opportunity, but responsibility is regulating the industry. If you take, for example, California, they have over 50 operators that have AV permits. Not all of them have the technical expertise, the financial wherewithal, or the safety culture to go the distance. And so how do we address entrance into this very critical high-risk space? And the last area to cover is safety. Robbie, you talked a lot about the statistics. There are opportunities for NHTSA to engage now, even short of setting AV standards. ADAS is going to be the stepping stones to building public trust and acceptance with technology. They've been talking about modernizing NCAP standards since Dr. Rosekind was there over 5 years ago. We need to get on with it with respect to improving safety. Think about the pedestrian fatalities that are increasing. If we implement standards to address improved pedestrian automatic emergency braking, that can save a lot of lives now, and you still have drivers in the car. So I'd say NHTSA needs to occupy that space. Bottom line, there's a whole lot of reasons for it, but they need to occupy that space.
I hate to put Nat in the hot seat because Nat's such a great guy, but Nat has been inside NHTSA. So I have two questions for you. One is a NHTSA question, which is, why can't we, you hear this over all the time and everyone's finally got to get a move on. Why? So what do you think we don't do that? And, is it all their fault and we're just throwing stones in glass houses? And number two is you do work for Aurora, which is wants to move goods, a trucking company, and maybe everyone else talks about cars. Maybe take a moment and give us the perspective from the truck side. So those two questions.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie, and thanks, Safe, for putting this on. I think this is really great, especially to see so many of colleagues. I guess I should call them now, but I definitely have known many of them for a decade or more being in this space. And I think I'll take a different tact with the regulation question. I think we've never really relied on regulations to instill trust in the public, and we seem to be on a narrative right now that is how we do that. And I think we at Aurora take a different approach. I think we believe that what Administrator Cliff was talking about, which was around transparency, we think that's really, really important to bring the public along on the journey. I mean, if you look at the ANPRM comments that came out, the industry is all over the place, right? The industry isn't unified in what it wants to see in terms of a federal motor vehicle safety standard. And I think that we have to be a little bit clearer in working with NHTSA along this journey. Super happy that NHTSA started the process of regulating automated driving systems. We believe that there's a difference between how you regulate those systems versus what you might get on a passenger vehicle today, to Debbie's excellent point earlier. But I think it's not all on NHTSA, right? Industry also has to come to the table. And I think industry has moved a lot, at least in the last 3 to 5 years, where there's been a much more concerted effort on the voluntary industry front. Kevin kind of picked up on that in his remarks, where the history of regulations, very few of them, if any, were like kind of just baked in we'll call it in the bowels of DOT. They really relied on industry voluntary standards, conversations with industry, and of course the very excellent work done by the research folks. Yes, I'm a little biased, out of VRTC, and sort of crafting those FMVSS performance-based standards that Kevin talked about. And so that work needs to continue. We need to accelerate that. And we also need to kind of remember that trust isn't solely on the responsibility of the industry, and that we have to bring the public along, and government is in a great position to do that in partnership with us. As far as the trucking side, it's pretty exciting, right? There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different players going on. But for the most part, everybody is generally trying to do the right thing. And I think the biggest gap I see is the continual kind of forgetting about trucking. And I think we would argue for more equity with trucking. If you look at the market dynamics, if you look at the potential safety impact, the equity in terms of people's lives, trucking has a lot to offer. And I think that we as a community need to actually pay a little bit more attention to trucking to ensure that it gets equal footing with all the discussions going on with the pass car side.
Yeah, Nat, the whole trucking thing is so confounding, because everyone says it's going to happen first. There's this business case and we're going to make it happen. And then every time you see a legislative proposal go forward, and even the ones you can't get for cars, but the first thing they dump out are trucking. And so you wonder about just the cost of goods. And it is true we have a lot of truck drivers, but at the same time, we have an incredible shortage on our roads. And as I said before, if we're going to bring manufacturing and back to the United States, And, just the increase of traffic, we're going to need to find ways to move these goods. And, in new vehicles that are autonomous and not really looking like 18-wheelers, but can be very different if one goes online and see what's going on. And it's really, once again, it's like we're doing the exact opposite of what you think you would do if you're a rational country or a group of people. Let's go to Desi for a moment. So we'll move back to cars. She's sitting at Ford. And here you have to make all these decisions with all this uncertainty. Like, why is now the moment? And why, if we don't get this right now, we could really face an issue. And as I think Jack said, maybe invent things here, but then lose them to others.
Well, first of all, thank you, Robbie, and thank you to SAFE for sponsoring such an incredible conversation. We're at such a point of inflection. And if you listen, as we listen to Dr. Cliff and Kevin articulate some of the challenges, I think we're also at a place, a call to action. We have the opportunity to not only reshape mobility to deliver a safer, greener, and more connected community, but also to help reshape and define mobility and improve access for everyone. And to me, that's the why. That's the why we need to come together across the industry and with our government to be able to create a pathway to deployment. We have the technology, as my colleagues before me articulated. We've got fantastic safety features that are going into our vehicles every day. And at Ford, I'm pretty proud to say we've taken things, as Debbie mentioned, like autonomous emergency braking, and we have exceeded the memorandum of understanding and are on a pace to deploy it across our fleets because we believe that there is real world safety benefits. And again, going back to the stat that everyone goes back to, 94% of accidents are caused by human error. And the more we can assist drivers in the near term with ADAS technologies and eventually with autonomous vehicles, we're going to really recreate mobility and access to transportation. And we're at a place where broad deployment is limited. We need to work together. We do not have a pathway to deploy broader. And I think that all of us are here because we're committed to working together to help NHTSA create a pathway, but we need help.
I think that broad deployment question is, something to note. I brought up some statistics about how if we allowed just, not even exemptions of all vehicles. By the way, the worst named thing ever, because once you say something's exempt, it's basically like you've lost. But really, it doesn't mean they're less safe. But if you cannot redesign, you can think about retooling your factories or how you want to roll this out. And there's money that the federal government doesn't have to pay. All they really need to do is provide this optionality for companies to do it. And we looked and said there's 10 factories that could be retooled right now in anticipation for a type of rollout for commercial use, both for just food delivery, take a neuro, or the movement of people, and then ultimately larger goods like NAT. And it's really like once again, it's like leaving money on the table that private industry is willing to do and create 40,000 jobs in that retooling. So let me turn to Dean for a moment. Dean, as I said, you've been everywhere. You've seen it all. So when I say to you, what do you mean by when we say regulation, like what NHTSA should do? People talk about guidance versus standards versus prescriptive and not to be too prescriptive. So why don't you give us a sense of where do you think we really need them to tell the industry or the industry to work with them on?
Okay, thank you, Robbie. And again, like the others have said, it's glad to be here with such a distinguished panel. Thanks to SAFE for putting this together. Thanks for all the comments by everyone, including Dr. Cliff. I guess I represent, but I'm in good company here on this panel with Motional being driven around what we talked about in the opening comments, right? Basically the ride sharing and full autonomous ride sharing opportunity. And so we do believe strongly in the opportunity ultimately to improve safety on America's roads, and we really enjoy being part of that journey. I think a lot of what we're talking about here is, meanwhile, as we go through a very innovative phase, which you can see from the number of companies involved, the different technologies that are being experimented with, the discussions we're having around trying to come up with common methods to make sure that those systems are safe. I think there's a great amount of, dynamic nature to this. And so I think one of our approaches has been not necessarily to look immediately for regulatory prescriptiveness, but probably more like a framework that we all can operate within and that doesn't stifle innovation, and also allows us as an industry to work in the multiple ways that we do and we have in the automotive industry in the past, as well as other industries, collaborate. So we collaborate on standards that have already been mentioned, creating standards that build consensus around particular aspects of safety, performance of autonomous vehicles, perhaps safety standards that could be applied to certain parts of the vehicles, uses of AI, right, to help to improve the performance of an autonomous vehicle. So standards development, as well as best practice development. I know at Motional, we were involved with many, some partners that are here in this body, as well as others around the world, not just in the US, but global OEMs, tier ones, that were involved in defining a safety first white paper that was one of the first communications of a step-by-step approach to develop the whole system, whole automated driving system from the ground up to be safe. So white papers have a role, standards have a role, industry consortiums, best practices have a role. I think we just believe very strongly in collaboration. We also just recently believe there's a role for existing external advisory bodies and groups like TÜV Süd that we've used to try to certify some of the process behind our safety statements. At Motional, we believe that you build in safety, and safety culture, I think, is a very strong term around building safety from the ground up into the system as you design it, but that the responsibility resides at the end to provide good argumentation, good evidence, right, that the system is ready. And we think there's a strong role and some good partnerships we've had to try to get external inputs into that, as well as all the other sources. So if you take that all into consideration, and we come back to discussing regulation or an FMVSS or some sort of requirement on some safety argumentation that provides a common framework, I think that's sort of what we're looking at in concert with these other mechanisms by which globally and within the US, we can establish this common performance of AV thinking. All doing that, understanding that we're still developing the technology and we need to have enough room for that innovation process to work itself out. So thank you.
No, thanks for that. Jack, maybe share with us in a similar question, like how do you think about this, and where we are in prescription versus guidance versus standards and everything else. So if you could write it, what would it look like at this point in time?
Sure, and I think Dean touched on something important, which is, traditional FMVSSs sometimes can be very detailed, down to particulars of a certain kind of sensor or something. What industry needs here is not that level of detail. We need performance standards that sets clear expectations on what is reasonably foreseeable for the automated vehicle to expect. And so this is really the heart of what's behind the IEEE P2846 standard that Kevin mentioned. And I should acknowledge the leadership team we have for this standard. I'm honored to have Waymo as our vice chair and Aurora as our secretary. And we have OEMs from around the world, tier ones, researchers, government entities. It's an incredible collection of entities that are coming together to really think deeply about what is reasonably foreseeable for an automated vehicle to expect about the behavior of other road users. And then from a performance standard, from a regulation standpoint, if you define those boundaries then using IEEE P2846, it provides clear guidance then to the industry on what the automated vehicle should be able to handle, and maybe what's out of scope, for them to be able to handle. And so who cares what kind of sensor mix you have? Maybe you've got some proprietary sensors. Maybe you have a mix of different kinds of sensors. It's how does the vehicle perform, and is it able to navigate safely based on what's reasonably foreseeable in the real world? And that's what's behind that standard. And we think that it presents an excellent starting point for NHTSA to provide clear guidance to industry on what is reasonably foreseeable for an automated vehicle to assume about the behavior of other road users. And so that's why we say that the time is now, and we can. We don't need to be specifying an insane amount of detail on the implementation because of the innovation that's going to happen in this space. But we do have an opportunity to set clear expectations for society on what should the vehicles be able to do and what is reasonably foreseeable or not.
So Debbie, I'm going to turn to you. You know, basically, there's all these organizations. I haven't seen so many letters since I did my latest eye test. Hard to comprehend. You know, IEEE, you know, SAE, you know, all these problems. What is the role for NHTSA? And I think Kevin Vincent gets the idea, like, look, it's sort of like a self-standard in the sense that it's the industry coming up with that. But then there's different groups of people in different ones of these organizations. So how do you see, you know, that, and how do you pick a winner, or should there not be a winner per se?
Yeah, Robbie, great question. I think some of this is because organically some of these groups have risen up, and certainly my fellow panelists have done some great work populating those groups and establishing those standards. But I think about my experience with other modes of transportation. The Association of American Railroads sets a lot of standards for the railroad industry that FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, incorporates by reference. The RTCA sets a lot of standards in the aviation space. Again, these are international standards, your transponders, your cockpit voice recorders, requirements that FAA designates that are very technical in nature. And so I do think that there is a pathway for industry development of standards, but I would say one of the challenges that has existed has been that to date, there have been factions of different groups that have developed competing standards or guidelines, different publications. I think NHTSA really needs to take a leadership role in facilitating some of that effort to ensure that all parties are represented, that there's an equitable playing field for both the traditional OEMs, the tech sector, safety advocates. Everyone needs to be at the table, but there's more that I think can be done through this voluntary effort. I will say I'm not a fan of the Administrative Procedures Act. At NTSB, we made recommendations for many, many years on a number of different things. The rulemaking process is incredibly slow, and I think that's one of the reasons internationally that people are eating our lunch, is because if we try to regulate everything, the technology is going to move faster than the regulations, and it's not going to make sense.
It's exciting to know that West Side Story is getting a remake in the coming months, because this is like that. As you said, we've got gangs on each side. So we'll need the AV version of the West Side Story, Debbie. I have one more question for you, Debbie, just because I think it's fascinating, and I hope you don't mind. But, you know, here you were at the top of the NTSB and, you know, involved in all these, and then suddenly you went to private industry. So I'd just be curious, like, now that you're on the other side of the fence, you know, do you have any reflections of what you found or come away from that?
Absolutely. So, you know, I had the opportunity to be at the NTSB for 10 years and then 5 years at the nonprofit National Safety Council, who helped establish PAVE, which is the Partners for Automated Vehicle Education, which is something that I think is very beneficial. I've been at Waymo. I was at Waymo for 2 years, and then now with Velodyne. And I would say one of the things that came through loud and clear to me during my time at Waymo is some of the smartest people in the world are working to solve this problem, to try to move us towards automation. All my fellow panelists are part of that cadre. And people are extremely committed to safety. I will tell you that I saw that firsthand, very committed. And I would say the thing that was very obvious to me is that this problem, this challenge that we're facing, is much more complex and more complicated than I think many people understand. And I would say that one of the challenges that we have is the way that the federal government is set up with civil servants is the technology is moving so quickly and the thinking evolves so rapidly that I absolutely believe that the federal government has to include industry at the table in order to come up with some of the best products. And so I'd say those were things that probably I didn't think when I was on the government side, but having had the opportunity to be on the other side, I really have a tremendous appreciation for how difficult this issue is. And I think a lot of people have said it, but it's going to take much longer than we think to widely deploy AVs, fully self-driving AVs across our system and to turn the system over. And so I think we absolutely have to focus on the ADAS opportunities that we have in front of us.
Yeah, I think that's a misconception of everyone, which is, everyone talks about this final product and just how many lives could be saved with other technologies, but also just geofencing. There's so many use cases we could use for many of the technologies we have today or in the very near future. And I think that we can't get into this habit of saying like it has to be able to go everywhere all the time. And for people who don't do this every day, that's sort of this misconception. When we'll be ready. There's so many other opportunities there. Desi, you like to talk about trust and this aspect of it all. So maybe share some comments on that.
Thank you. I think trust is going to be a key enabler to a broad acceptance of the technology. And Nat articulated a couple of points that I'd like to build on. I think this is a obligation for all of us. We can't leave it to just regulators or we can't leave it to industry. It's us as a whole. But I think we need to step back and educate consumers on what the technology is capable of doing. And frankly, in the short term, as we talk about ADAS, what their role is in the vehicle. Because as we walk on our journey to autonomous vehicle, we've got this, kind of this big segment now where drivers have increased driver assist technologies, but they are still commanding the vehicle. And we need them to recognize that that's their role in order to deliver on those safety benefits. One of the things that Ford and many people have done is contributed to the voluntary safety self-assessment that NHTSA has published. And for us, we've entitled it A Matter of Trust, but it goes down this journey of how do we share technical knowledge with consumers in a way that they can consume the data and become more confident. And as we learn more about the technologies and the capabilities, and frankly, some of the misuse cases, it's up to all of us to not only learn from those experiences, but be able to incorporate those as we develop improved technologies and ultimately advancements that give us autonomous vehicles. Trust is key. Trust is a huge word for everybody, but I think as we think about, kind of what have we learned as we, learn to drive and as we become mature and experienced drivers, and how does technology now make it easier for drivers to navigate in this complicated world where they are faced with distractions, in everything that they do. And I think this is a wonderful place for ADAS and AVs, right? This is kind of the theme of, our conversation today. This is such an important opportunity for us to serve our customers in such a special way, but we need to do it and be mindful of trust. And I think that everyone has a role in developing and anchoring trust, industry, academia, regulators. It's something we all need to work together. And it's probably one of the reasons all of us are on this panel, because we're passionate about, helping create the right awareness to enable this broader deployment.
So I have a question for everyone, or whoever wants to answer, which is about optimism versus pessimism. So on one hand, Debbie just, I think a few answers ago talked about, the amount of time it takes. At the same time, here we are in a pandemic where in the United States, there was no vaccine. We've never developed the drug faster. This country got it together, developed this drug. It's now out there. Now we have put shots in the arms of hundreds of millions of people. Just think of that. And so here we are. Are you pessimistic or optimistic? And is this just classic America, can't get it right in the beginning, and in some way will get out of its own way and figure this out? I guess I throw that out there. You can frame that any way you want. But to me, I think we're very down on the ability to do this here because of all these problems. But at the same time, we somehow find a way to get out of our way many times. So I don't know who wants to raise their hand first, but maybe someone have raised their hand that we'll turn the screen to you. Okay, Nat.
Just because I'm a glutton for punishment. Yes, I think. I don't know. No, I think at times we don't celebrate enough all the work that has been done and continues to be done. And I think it really helps to kind of separate the issues. You know, a lot of the reasons why we talk about regulation is really to help with the enablement with the states, right? Like, I think when I talk to our state partners, you know, particularly in Texas where we're operating, or in PennDOT, Pennsylvania, you know, there's this sort of general sense of like, we don't know enough. Can you guys help us understand? And certainly regulations have sort of helped ease that sort of understanding to some extent at the state level. But I think that there is so much going on and has been going on, and that's why we're able to kind of move where we are. And we just don't talk about it enough. So what are some of those things? So you mentioned the alphabet soup of standards group going on. We only participate in the ones that we think actually add value. So like, we're super happy that Jack decided to do the IEEE thing because we think that's really, really important. We're also in the AVSC for that very reason as well. And the way I look at it is not so much that they're competing, but they're different facets of this safety question that need to be answered over time. And this is a long journey. And so regulations have a place in that gets supported by voluntary industry standards. But I also think we shouldn't forget about the power of guidance. You know, Desi mentioned the automatic emergency braking memorandum of agreement with NHTSA that got the industry to agree over the course of 4 years to put automatic emergency braking as standard without a regulation. That was a win for consumers. That was a win for safety. It was a win for the American public. And that happened in kind of rapid fashion. I think we hashed that agreement out over the course of a couple months. It wasn't a couple of years, and it definitely wasn't the 8+ years I worked on the rear visibility rule, for example. So I think there are good things we can do together collaboratively with NHTSA and DOT that doesn't involve the heavy regulated stick, let's say, of trying to do cost benefits and all these other kind of things that are definitely necessary when you're imposing costs on the entire industry to make sure that actually meets the benefits. And so that's still an approach we need to do. Congress still needs to do its part, right? You know, you mentioned the exemptions thing. And I take your point about the word because it does have a certain ring to it that actually doesn't give credit to actually how that process works. But we know we need to move that lever. You know, for Aurora's purposes, you know, that's really our partner's challenge, and we sort of support them in that effort. But for us, we're very much focused on the Aurora driver and the safety of that particular enterprise, as opposed to how many vehicles can be mass sold to consumers on any given year. I think the thing that I would say I do worry about, and we talked on this a little bit earlier, is the U.S. does need to get engaged. You know, I'm in lots of conversations all the time with folks in Japan and Europe, and there's a real thirst for the U.S. to come kind of back into those forums. And I've actually heard pretty recently that they have seen us start showing up again, which is awesome. Because I think we can't end up in a situation where we have kind of disparate regulatory approaches for this technology. I mean, it will be ubiquitous. I think that's our hope. But it will start small, Robbie, as you mentioned, right? It'll be these very tailored ODDs. And I think that's the part that's really complicated because we've been a one-size-fits-all country for a very long time. So have all the other countries. And I think we need to recognize that that's not this technology. This technology will exist in various different pockets and various different applications. And so I am more on the kind of the optimism side that we actually are doing the right things. There's some things we need to be doing a little bit faster, but I think the next 3 to 5 years are going to be really, really exciting.
Actually, in my first call with a certain administrator, who will go nameless, he was before. Actually, it was that international standard setting. What really started to concern me is how you see how people who set the standards write the rules to their own economic benefit. And it's really important that the United States shows up, not just to have that, global convergence, but just also to make sure that our technology is in the catbird seat. And that's, we've gotten tremendous economic gain after World War II, and we were so engaged in those bodies. And I think people don't quite realize that. Anyone else want to speak to the pessimism versus optimism? Okay, Desi.
First of all, I'm an optimist, so I'll start with my optimistic lens. And we kind of articulated it. These technologies have an opportunity to create a safer world, period. Whether it's advanced driver assist technologies or ultimately AVs, we will contribute to a better world with more access to mobility, and that's wonderful. If I do have a worry, though, it is the time it will take for us to get to meaningful deployment. And Nat highlighted several of those tenets, but we're sitting at a place where we have technologies and we have consortiums to help NHTSA craft a pathway to deployment. And frankly, other countries are moving past us. And I welcome the opportunity for us to kind of step back and kind of revisit our purpose. Our purpose is to create a safer world and a more sustainable world. And, I want to be part of a solution. And I think it's time for us to up our game on timing. We can't continue to have a framework that takes so long. I think the intent is good, but we just need to modernize our approach to rulemaking. And I think I speak on behalf of my fellow panelists. We're here to help. What does it take to help create the right data set to make us comfortable to create a framework? I don't know that we need to define it in a traditional FMVSS perspective, because we know the technology is evolving too fast. And frankly, that will hinder progress. And so that's my, maybe I didn't answer your question perfectly, but I'm optimistic, but I'm worried that we could lose this opportunity.
Dean, what do you think about optimism, pessimism, or anything else?
I was going to say, I think everybody working in this, everybody working in this area, I think, is an optimist. So I'm definitely optimistic that, I think Debbie mentioned it best, right? You have some of the smartest minds working on this problem. And I think if we look at history and other industries, we'll find that sort of energy behind something will get us through to the solution. And anybody that's working in this area probably feels that way. One point that came to mind was there have been, if we talk about standards or regulations, there have been, say, in the ADAS areas, and I think we mentioned like the rear vision and AEB sorts of mandates that have came about. There's been a strategy in other parts of the world to use these things to increase acceptance, right, or even increase adoption of certain technologies. And I would just put that out as a question more than that we shall do that. And that's an interesting approach. If we think that ultimately we'll end up with safer roads if we have these technologies, just like we do with AEB and rear cameras, how would we do this in a way that promotes adoption of the technologies, given all these challenges? So.
And Jack, maybe we'll end with, first we'll go Jack, then Debbie, then I'll share my pessimism.
Jack. I'm gonna down on you for that, Robbie. So, no, I'd love to share two thoughts. Thank you for the opportunity. And I guess in case this is my last chance to speak, I just want to say I'm honored to be on this panel with so many fantastic colleagues who are all passionate about solving these problems for the industry and for the United States. So it's an amazing journey we're on together, and I'm honored to be on it with all of you. So two things that give me optimism. The first is, we talked about kind of the standard soup sort of mess. And I think that was actually, it is an accurate description, I think circa I don't know, pre-COVID. But I think in the last 18 months, let's say, I think there's been a new sense of collaboration between different standards development organizations, where each organization is realizing that, you know what, no one standards development organization is going to have the one standard to rule them all. And that there are complementary standards that serve different purposes, as Nat said. So for example, even just in IEEE 2046, we have formal liaison relationships with both ISO and SAE to make sure that everything that we're doing is complementary to the standards that are being created in those other organizations. So this new sense of collaboration and consensus within the industry, that one, not only is it going to take a collection of different standards, but two, industry coming together in key standards like 2846 to align on important performance-based definitions of what safety even means, gives me hope that the industry is in a really healthy place for that open dialogue and transparency and collaboration that the regulator has needed to see, I think, in order for them to feel comfortable acting. So if there's anything we could maybe highlight to our friends at NHTSA, is that industry is coming together and is gaining consensus, and so thus it is the time to start issuing some guidance and regulation. The second is, and a couple different folks have mentioned this, is ADAS, and I think we shouldn't forget about this, particularly in the trust piece that both Desi and Debbie mentioned, which is, the dictionary definition of trust is believing in the character, strength, or truth of something, and that's not words we typically attribute to a machine. But as regular drivers and everyday folks like ourselves have an opportunity to own cars with more advanced driver assistance systems that have maybe 360-degree sensing, or you have mapping technology that was originally developed for automated vehicles is now being used in a driver assistance vehicle. You're going to get a more capable and even safer driver assistance experience. And the more people that get exposed to that, we think the more the public is going to understand and believe in the benefits of these foundational technologies that make up a driverless vehicle as well. And so I think raising the bar and bringing the, for example, the US NCAP standards up to par with what Europe is doing, which again is generation or two ahead of where the US is today, can contribute to creating that public trust, because it will give more and more people an opportunity to experience driver assistance technology and how it saves lives on an everyday basis. So those two things give me hope and optimism. And with that, I'd be happy to turn it over to Debbie. I'd love to hear her thoughts as well.
Well, thanks. And it's been an honor and a privilege to be with all of you today. Robbie, thank you for doing this and continuing this conversation. Because I was at the NTSB, Robbie, I'm also kind of Debbie Downer. And so I will also be pessimistic with you, but I'm going to be optimistic and pessimistic. And I'm going to share one word that I think embodies both of those things in our connected, shared, electric and safe future, Tesla. I think Tesla is an embodiment of both the optimism and the pessimism of this issue. No one has done more to advance the adoption of EVs and push others to move on this than Tesla. But I think when it comes to automation, Tesla has continued to exhibit a lack of respect for safety. The way that they have called the terminology that they use for their technology, the way that they've deployed it, I'd say this is the single most frequent conversation that I have to have with members of the public, my family, friends, about automation that people are confused about. And so I would just say, I think Tesla has shown us what's possible, how to move quickly, how to do the things that we want to do, but they've also shown us the risks of moving quickly. And so I'd say Tesla would be my example of both optimism and pessimism.
You couldn't have thrown that bomb earlier in the discussion. That would have just sparked things up so much earlier. Although I do have to say, for a group talking about safety, we have both quoted Shakespeare and Lord of the Rings at the same time, the standard that will rule them all. Where else can you get that? So here's my sense is that, you know, I think Americans and American business is very good at, you know, seeing where the business opportunity is. And ultimately, I'm optimistic that there will, and maybe this goes to Debbie's pessimism, hopefully there'll be responsible parties that do it, but there is great economic benefit. And ultimately, people, unless they are absolutely banned, will find ways to roll it out, and that will drive change. My pessimism is the politics part and the, you know, the regulatory part, which is it seems like everyone has a lack of incentive to do anything, and that the interest groups that always hold us up, whether it be you know, Teamsters or, you know, safety advocates or you know, trial lawyers or, you know, regulators who, you know, there's a lot of risk in actually saying go forward and then something goes wrong. So I just see that landscape. So I'm optimistic that people will keep trying and we'll figure it out, and then we'll just buy fiat, and then it will begin to shape itself. I guess that's my sense of what might happen. Maybe that speaks to me being out of business and not doing anything, because just let you guys continue to innovate in your companies. I guess we'll end on this last question, and we probably don't have time for everyone, but I just talked about the politics. What has been, and I know all of you are more the technical people, but if you had to say, like, it is kind of confounding, right? There's so many good benefits here, not perfect right now, but yet so many people aren't advocating for it. Not the general public. We have all these interest groups. So if you had to change the narrative very quickly in 30 seconds, each one of you, where would you want that narrative to change? I mean, I hate to say it, but safety hasn't really worked. And we've just gone through a pandemic where hundreds of thousands of people have died and no one's really cared. I used to say, we have a pandemic on our roads. And really, now we have had a pandemic and no one seemed to be too concerned. So something has to change. I just feel I'd be curious in 30 seconds if anyone has a view of what they might they think we should change as a group selling this and hopefully building new advocates. Anyone?
I'll give a go at it, Robbie. So I think part of the challenge with the safety argument is if the only acceptable level of safety for machine automation is perfect safety, then we'll never deploy anything, because there's no such thing as perfect safety even for a human driver. You know, the safest automated vehicle would be the one that never leaves the garage. So we have to have an open and honest conversation about what safety means and what is reasonable to expect from the technology, so that we can have something that delivers incredible safety benefits. Because, you know, keeping a perfect bar as the measure means we're saying it's okay that 100 people die every day on the roads in the US, and that shouldn't be okay to any of us. And we've become immune to that, but we really need to be sensitive to that again, because that's the cost of doing nothing, is to continue to accept that and be okay with it, and we shouldn't be.
I thought Jack gave a fantastic answer to the question. I would just say, in order to help people move along that continuum to what they'll accept, is I think we have to continue to voluntarily deploy technologies that are the stair steps to automation, to build that confidence so that people don't have a negative reaction to greater automation. We've seen technology save thousands of lives in aviation, and it happened slowly over time. It wasn't in one fell swoop.
That's a great point about aviation and how, you know, the record is just unbelievable now. I think it's over 15 years without a, you know, major crash in the United States. And we didn't get the data sharing, but also quite important. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to say? Okay.
I have just, you know, before we part here, I think there's nothing wrong with our North Star of, you know, reduced fatalities or no fatalities. I get the politics and, you know, the journey isn't going to be straightforward, but I think when we go back on the opportunity to have no fatalities tied to accidents, I think that's a wonderful North Star. And, you know, I don't want to lose that.
Oh yeah, I wasn't saying we definitely need that North Star. I was just saying, like, from a political context, you know, how do we reshape some of the you know, advocacy out there, and just, you know, where the political leaders, the regulatory leaders realize, like, now's the moment. And you know, I ultimately think you the economic growth questions, which have a positive and negative, and then also this technology competition with China, which has laid out 10 things that they're going to go after, and this is squarely in one of them. It's really important at this moment politically. So I'm just trying to find the best arguments. Well, with that, I think, as I said, I have to take my daughter to CVS in a human-driven car. But I look forward to continuing the conversation with the five of you and with everyone who's been listening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robbie.
Yep, thank you.